Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Crypto Convos. My name is Vincent Berk. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Quantum Exchange. Now, this is not my first go around at podcasts. You may recall me from Berk Bites, or you might be subscribed to my weekly security newsletter. In either case, this is the first one of Crypto Convos at Quantum Exchange, and I'm very excited to get started. Now, one thing to mention, the title says Crypto Convos, but really, in addition to looking at cryptography and the future of cryptography and legislation around cryptography, I am also very interested in diverse and hopefully even polarizing opinions on the overall cybersecurity space, and even all the way to just IT infrastructure if it comes to it. Now, to get that kicked off, I have an inaugural guest, Adam Gordon, and he is labeled an edutainer, so it should be an interesting conversation. Now, Adam joins us from ITProTV, which is exciting. You should be very familiar with sharing opinions that are polarizing or diverse. So, Adam, welcome. Why don't you spend a few minutes explaining what you do and what ITProTV does?
Absolutely, and thank you, Vince, for the opportunity to join you and spend some time chatting. So ITProTV was founded about just about 8 years ago now, and it was an outgrowth of the idea of training. How do we approach training in the education and e-learning space? And the traditional training models, especially the e-learning related training models and online models, were, shall we say, a little bit lacking, right? A little bit lackluster, especially if you're doing e-learning. Traditionally, it would have been a very asynchronous solution. It would have been very flat and one-dimensional. You would listen to somebody talking, probably see a lot of slides, not see a lot of interaction. And we've all been through those things, and we've probably all, unfortunately, been bored by them. The driving force behind the thought of founding ITProTV, the two founders, Tim Broom and Don Pizzette, was really the idea of how can we enable the learning experience you get in a traditional live training environment with an instructor and people interacting, but take that online and give that to people that are going to learn asynchronously. And came up with the idea of being able to do that in a talk show-like format with a facilitated delivery. So we have two, we call ourselves edutainers now, but two people that are going to be involved in the delivery of an episode. Traditionally, you have a host who facilitates, subject matter experts such as myself or you, who would be talking about things. And we have really got that down to a consumable amount of knowledge. So about a 20-minute segment is about right for most learners who are going to be able to consume a topic. And we walk through a quick overview, followed by a pretty usually intensive hands-on technical demonstration. So we don't just tell you something, we actually show you how to do it. And we invite you to follow along with us. And the good thing about it is you can pause, you can come back to it, do a little external work, research, a lab, etc. And you can come back and consume as often as necessary. It's essentially like Netflix in the sense that it's a subscription model. And you are able to consume as often and as much as you would either care to or want to from a library of tens of thousands of hours of content at this point across multiple verticals.
Well, thank you for that. So I have some experience with this, and I want to see if I can elicit an opinion on this one, because I've done a variety of companies, and I have had to deal with people get phished, right? People click links. People are susceptible to this, and your form factor is interesting to me because, of course, one of the things you do is you try to get people trained up, right? A little bit like, well, if you want to participate in traffic, you need a driver's license. You need to know at least a little bit the fundamental rules of what others are going to do in traffic so that you will not have a crash, right? The internet seems to be very different. We buy ourselves a phone and now we're online, right? So the concept of training and having training in a form factor that is educational as well as entertaining, I think it's very important. The reason I say that is because things that I have seen is what ends up happening is, well, you have to get trained for HR related issues. You have to get trained on your particular software systems, processes in the business. You have to get recertified. there's always assigned training in businesses, and generally they happen on Friday afternoons, and then they happen by as much click through as the individual can do, right? So to get and I mean, tell me, you've noticed that, right? Is the entire premise of your business is to make it such that people want to take the training and learn from it.
Well, we hope, and certainly I think it's a fair assessment, right? That we want to draw people in, we want to engage them and get them excited about training. We certainly do provide things like security awareness training, as you were suggesting, so corporate-related compliance kind of training. But we also spend a lot of our time and a lot of our content across different verticals. Is targeted, for instance, at auditors. We have a channel or an area called ITProTV that's specific to the audit space, so information security and financial auditing, things of that nature, best practices, recertification, continuing education, things of that nature. There are podcasts that we spin up tied to those training events as well. So we have a lot of different modalities through the channels to learn. We do the same thing in the IT pro space for certification. So, the Microsoft, Cisco kind of training events, CompTIA, et cetera, and office skills, as well as business-related soft skills. So there's a great variety. We're actually bringing a new channel online soon, relaunching and extending it, called Health Pro, which will deal with health-related compliance and IT related concerns in that space. So there's a lot of different opportunity to engage, but you're right, at the heart of all of those models in terms of modality and silo or vertical is the idea of engaging the learner. So you're not just clicking through mindlessly and then hoping you can remember enough to take a quiz, right? And get that piece of paper, that certification or whatever. It's really about engaging you in the learning process that excites you and motivates you to want to do more.
Yeah. It's not just getting the 4 out of 5 on the quiz. Now here for the more polarizing opinion, and this is something that I'm not the only one who said this, right? There's others in the industry that say this, is that, as we go through building more and more secure systems, right? Like I'm from the day of our hosts files. As long as you put the host name in the our hosts file, you could log in with the same username you did, right? Like no security whatsoever, all the way to sort of where we are now, where everything is essentially encrypted. In that sense, computing systems have become more secure. Now, generally in any type of design system, if there is an adversarial attack, the adversarial attack goes after the weakest link, right? Premise I'm making is the weakest link has slowly become the individual. Now, I realize this is a polarizing opinion. I'm hoping you have thoughts on this, and whether or not you agree with me or you see this, right? Because we see compromises and we see software vulnerabilities all the time. But I'm conjecturing that we have increasingly moved to the individual, the person, as the weakest link in the security chain. What do you think?
So, I would hazard to say that I don't think it's an evolving trend, right? You're indicating, well, I think recently, maybe last 10, 15 years, we've seen a shift, right? I would argue that I think the human's always been one of the most weak areas or weakest links in that mix. I think the difference, I were chatting a little bit about this before we got started, has been the enablement technologies, right, that sit behind and around the human, all of us, by the way, right, that allow us to consume, right, putting the power of essentially a computer that's more powerful than the computer used to put men on the moon, right, not that long ago, and putting it into a form factor I can hold in my hand or wear on my wrist. And by the way, the computers you have in your hand and on your wrist are more powerful, right, than the computers that launched men to the moon in the late 1960s. Giving us that kind of power in a form factor that we can drive around, we can wear, we can interact with, has been a great enabler. I mean, look at all the things we've been able to do. The problem is, without training humans about the fundamentals, right, of best practices, of security, of understanding how to survive and thrive in that ecosystem, we have highlighted and shown a spotlight on the fact that we're still operating from the mindset of an analog world, even though we're in a digitally hyper-connected, hyper-converged space. I love the talk track recently about the idea of the emergence and the value of the metaverse, right? Whether you agree with it and its premise and the vision that Mark Zuckerberg and many others have for it notwithstanding, but the idea of the hyper-connected, interactive, virtual space that we can create essentially a community commons in a 3.0 or 4.0 manner is really interesting and engaging and enticing. But I don't hear anything about the rules of engagement from a security standpoint and from a community standpoint with regards to best practices, right? And how we should govern ourselves there. And I think it's just a repetition when you look at that of what we're seeing and have seen for a long time. Humans have traditionally proven that when we are given more advanced technologies, we often, unfortunately, put them to use in ways that lead to more dire outcomes more often than not. And while I don't think it's the end of humanity as we know it, just because we've enabled the cloud and put it in your hand, I do think it really speaks to a fundamental issue that's a recurring theme, which is, if we can't really understand as individuals how to safeguard ourselves and provide that capability in mass to those that are going to consume, should we be consuming in ways that allow bad actors to have more access and therefore do more harm? Or should we be focusing more on best practices that build those bulwarks and really help us to secure before we simply just keep generating new technologies that open those chasms even wider? And I think that's really the fundamental question or the architecture element that I struggle with, right? When I consult with clients and I talk with key technology thought leaders about, ideas and trends, I'm always coming back to basics and fundamentals. Why are we not spending more time helping people to understand that they need to be more secure and enabling them to do so? A good example is a default setting that could easily allow for more secure configuration in any number of technology platforms, but is not enabled because we're concerned about whether or not it's the right thing to do, because it may be more confusing or harder for a user to engage. And I think until we square those boxes, we're going to be looking at the same kind of outcomes.
Yeah, you touched on 3 or 4 topics that I think we could spend quite a bit of time talking about. But one that I want to run by you and see if I got you right on this is one topic that I used to, decades ago when I was much younger and more brazen with my opinions, would often speak of, is that a lot of the companies capitalizing on the growth of the internet, right, we're greatly benefiting from it, right? Like, and this is not just social media. It's just, anyone who was benefiting from that explosive growth. Few took the responsibility that comes with enabling it, right? And so, and I used to have a list, right? I would separate, like, this is a company that takes the responsibility for the power that they're putting in the hands of the people, and this is a company that simply benefits. And now we're not going to go over that list, but I wonder how you see that, and if you agree with that, and if you think that's improving or actually is getting worse.
So I do agree with it. I am of the same mind in that respect, and I have been for a long time as well. And I think our list would probably look very similar, if not almost identical. But I do think it's interesting, right? Because corporate responsibility, which is a term that is very polarizing and very charged with a lot of import ambiguity and potential misunderstanding, right? There's a lot of ways you can go with that. But if we strip away a lot of the hyperbole that goes around that conversation, really just focus on one aspect that I think is very tangible, which is, are companies in the technology space the enablers of the cloud, for instance? So without being personal and specific to technology companies, let's just assume we know who the top 5 or 10 may be, right? We all interact with them and use their technology and probably carry their technology around with us every day. When you look at the fact that the majority of those companies spend tremendous amounts of dollars marketing the value of their technology, but don't invest almost any, if any, of those dollars, and certainly nowhere near that amount, in educating the consumers of those products to understand how to use them in a secure, responsible, and therefore ultimately better way. I mean, just imagine, right? We often have these conversations. Many people sit around and think along these lines, but nothing happens as a result of them. But imagine, or very rarely does it does, imagine if companies pledged to put, and let's keep it a relatively straightforward and simple number, 1% of their gross revenue stream every year, put that into some sort of educational endeavors that would allow better security practices and more secure capabilities and ultimately actions to be brought to bear. What kind of a different world would we be living in? How many headlines would we see on a rolling basis about whatever company's been hacked and how much personally identifiable information has this week or this day been compromised. You know, you don't have to look very far. Look at what's happened in the last 72 hours. The Los Angeles school district, one of the biggest school districts, I think the biggest school district, if not the biggest, certainly the top 3 in the United States. Ransomware said, you know what, essentially, we're not paying the ransom. You gotta respect their decision without getting into the efficacy and the discussion about whether it is a good or a bad one. You have to respect the fact they took a stand. But 0.5 terabyte worth of data, right, has been dumped on the internet, personally identifiable information for students, for teachers, for faculty. And you know, whether that was a good or a bad decision, the reality is if best practices are in play around encrypting data, you mentioned earlier, well, all our transactions, all of our data, all those things are encrypted. I would hazard a guess to say, and I would actually hesitate to make a statement that says all, but I get where you're going. A lot of it is. Unfortunately, data at rest is not always encrypted when it should be. Data in transit should be, and there really is no reason why it would not be today. But data in use may or may not be, depending on the nature of the operating system and the way in which you choose to run your operating system and whether things have been allowed to get into that operating system that can compromise that data in a variety of ways. And so as a result, you know, we really don't spend enough time creating accountable action. We spend a lot of time telling stories about great value and exciting features. And I think that is a significant issue. And I think we could change that trajectory, but it would require spending money that is obviously clearly earmarked for other things.
Well, it's generally earmarked for the shareholder, right? And that's I think that's what you're driving at now. And I like this. I like this principle, right? Because it gets down to if we had only spent 1% figuring out what the negative impact is of smoking, the negative potential impacts of burning fossil fuel, like a lot of these, we would have potentially known much earlier. Then, you know, and it tends to take generations for humans to catch on to well, a more responsible use of a resource. Where I'm now labeling the cloud and the internet as a resource. You know, but that's a pattern, right? Like it's a pattern that we as mankind have seen. It takes time. It takes time for humanity to catch on, sometimes more than a generation. Do you believe that the fix to this is legislation, or do you think it should be philanthropy, or you know, where does it come from? How would we drive that?
So, you know, I think we're seeing a lot of activity in multiple spheres, right? I think we do see philanthropy, and it certainly is having an impact. You don't have to look very far. There are many philanthropic endeavors, right? So the Gates Foundation, certainly the work that Warren Buffett and many others are doing or have done, continue to do. Paul Allen and the work he has done with the money he has made over the decades at Microsoft before he retired. Right. You know, there are many initiatives that, from a philanthropic perspective, globally, not just in any one area, certainly in healthcare and many areas, are having tremendous impact. And I think it's a very valuable and important component of the solution. But I think the problem we run into is when you only rely on people to do the right thing and volunteer to do the right thing, and you're talking about a very small percentage of the very top wealthiest people in the world that are able to do those things at scale. Certainly there are many people that devote time and donate time and money in all sorts of ways. We never want to make anything but the best of those intentions, right, highlighted, because everybody's going to have an impact regardless of how big or small that investment is. But I think when you rely on people to do the right thing only, and there's no strategic guidance that comes from above, there's no regulatory and legal framework that you can attach those actions to that magnify them, but also enshrine them, right, culturally within the values of that civilization, I think it's hard to reach that tipping point, right? I mean, look at global warming. It's a perfect example, I think, of what we're talking about. You know, for decades, we've known individually and even collectively, regardless of the political implications of admitting that global warming is a thing, that we've had a problem and we know it's getting worse, and we could see the evidence of it. And we knew that at some point that was going to become a major issue. And you look at events like the hurricane season we're undergoing this year in the United States and the Atlantic and in the Pacific and globally in terms of the weather pattern around it. And you could see the impact of the most recent storm that hit the United States and hit Puerto Rico and hit other areas, and the devastation it's done and how quickly it intensified. And you don't have to go very far to see global warming is a real thing. And yet we're just now getting to the point where we're trying to come up with legislative ways to address global warming, and yet we can't really come together. I mean, we've had global climate summits for the better part of the last 30 or 40 years in one way or another at the UN, all the way down to regional blocs like the European Union, down to individual countries and companies that may involve themselves. I think it's got to be a solution that enacts itself from multiple vectors, but I think the challenge when you mention legislation or regulation in that breath is people say, well, hold on, I don't want to be told how I should donate or spend my time or allow my particular goodwill to be spent. I want to be in control of that. And I think we as people, as humans, have to understand that sometimes there is a need for some sort, right, of organizational thought process that may help us to get to that place. And individual will and collective action can coexist. And I think those are important things to consider. But I think you need a visionary, right? I think you need somebody who's going to be able to spell that out and really help those skeptics that often sit in the middle. If we think about the traditional bell curve, right? The majority of people are in the middle, right, kind of looking at it on the fence going, I'm not quite sure. I know there's a problem, but I don't know which way I want to go. You have the diehards on the left and the diehards on the right of the curve, and then you got everybody else. And I think you need somebody who can paint that picture, right, for those people in the middle to help them to understand, regardless of which way they move, right? This is not about politics. It's not about, perception. It's about understanding how you fit in. And I think people want to fit in. I think they want to do things, but I think they feel that their actions may not resonate because there's no way to amplify them. And I think that's where legislation and regulation can have a potential benefit.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our interview with Adam Gordon. Don't miss the second half of the informative and entertaining discussion in part 2, available November 2022.